Okay, so the civil rights struggle. Origins of African Americans come from Africa. If you look at the graphs or the pictures below, you can see how they were transported. The mortality rate on the trip over from Africa to here was called the Middle Passage. During the Middle Passage, about 15% of African Americans passed away. You can kind of tell it's not the most sanitary conditions, and they were packing there pretty tight. So if somebody were to get sick, then it spread pretty easy. And that's one of the reasons why the mortality rate was so high. So slavery was abolished in the North by 1804. If you remember from our talks about the Constitution, it was abolished. The slave trade, as far as the international slave trade, was abolished in 1808 by the Constitution. But after 1808, the South continued to do slave trade domestically between the southern states. Okay. Prior to 1793, slavery in the South was actually on decline, but because of Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin, then it became like a big booming business because it made cotton very, very profitable. One of the biggest court cases that you need to know prior to the Civil War is Dred Scott versus Sanford. This happened in 1857. There was a slave named Dred Scott. His owner died. His owner had lived in a free state, which was Illinois. Dred Scott sued for his freedom because, the person that he belonged to had died. The Supreme Court ruling was that slaves are not citizens, they are property and have no rights. Therefore, he could not bring the court case to trial, which made no sense because, he wasn't a citizen. So that was their logic in not giving him his freedom. So the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863, pretty much during the Civil War, actually in the middle of it. And this was to basically free slaves behind the enemy lines. This was a proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. So if you look at the picture, the red states are slave states that were in the Confederacy. The purple states were slave states that were in the Union. Blue states were free states in the Union. Port Bleeding, Kansas, which we'll talk about more later. And then the beige are just territories. They were not states yet. So basically, the Emancipation Proclamation affected all of the red states and purple states. All the blue ones were already abolished. Slavery had already been abolished where they were by 1863. So African American discrimination after the Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, we have the laws on the books, amendments to the Constitution. So if you remember when we talked about different amendments added to the Constitution later on, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments all deal with slavery. The 13th bans slavery and gives freedom to indentured servants and slaves. The 14th defines citizenship and what that means. And the 15th defines voting. So after the Civil War, there was something called Reconstruction. You'll learn about it a lot more once you get into American history. But Reconstruction is what it sounds like. They went in and tried to reconstruct the South because it was pretty damaged during the Civil War. Unfortunately, it did not go like Abraham Lincoln had wanted. When Andrew Johnson took office after Abraham Lincoln was killed, he kind of punished the South. So Reconstruction did not go quite as smoothly as it was originally intended and led to some bad feelings afterwards. But during Reconstruction, all of these southern states were under military jurisdiction. So there's military district number 1, military district number 2, 3, 4, and 5. So basically, the U.S. Army was in here over all of these states. After the Civil War, you have segregation in the South. The most famous of these are the Jim Crow laws, which, again, segregate black versus white. Or a lot of theirs back then would say white or colored. There were a lot of voting discriminations. They tried to prevent African Americans from coming out to the polls, which they did with a poll tax. A lot of times they did with a literacy test, a grandfather clause, or through intimidation like lynching, which was brought to the attention of the public by Ida B. Wells, who is this one right here, who is an activist. Okay, Plessy versus Ferguson is in 1896. This is a pretty important court case all the way from 1896 until the Civil Rights Act, until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was okay. So you could have separate facilities, but they had to be equal. Now, if you know anything about history, you know that they were separate, but they definitely were not equal. So there's Booker T. Washington. He was born in 1856. He died in 1919. He was born a slave. He's very famous because of the Tuskegee Institute. He emphasized vocational training for African Americans. His philosophy was wait, and in time we will get our civil rights. Then you have W.B. Du Bois, who was born in 1868, lived until 1963. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard. And then his philosophy was black men should stand up for their rights now. He helped found the NAACP. So the first time that we really see segregation kind of break down is in 1948. This is from President Truman, and he ordered an end to segregation in the military. Okay? So in the armed forces, there was no longer segregation after 1948. Does not mean that there was no longer discrimination, it's no longer segregation. In 1954, this is kind of what begins the whole desegregation throughout the country, is Brown versus the Board of Education. It happens in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. The Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection under the law. So you had Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and that ruling holds up until 1954, where Brown versus the Board of Education overrules that. Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal. Brown versus Board said equal for all. 1955, you have Rosa Parks, Montgomery, Alabama. And then that case was also taken to the Supreme Court, and they made a ruling in 1956 that public bus segregation was unconstitutional. Okay? Again, holding up and falling in line with the decision they made with Brown versus Board that equal for all. So you get the Montgomery bus boycott, where a lot of people refused to ride the buses. They would walk to work instead of paying to get on the bus. And this was a way to protest peacefully using financial tools. You had MLK Jr., or Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Baptist minister. His belief was nonviolent resistance, based a lot off of Mahatma Gandhi from India, who believed in nonviolence. Okay? This is an excerpt from one of his most famous speeches. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And that speech happened here at the March on Washington. Then you had the Freedom Riders. They were a group of people who rode on interstate buses to different places, specifically to the South, because even after the passage of Brown v. Board and the decision that the Supreme Court had on Rosa Parks, there were a lot of Southern states that still had Jim Crow laws and would not enforce the desegregation. So these people would get on buses and then come to these towns and then basically follow the federal ruling instead of the local ruling, which if you remember from our hierarchy of laws, federal is at top, state comes next, then local. So the federal ruling was the most important, which is what the Freedom Riders were trying to point out. They were following the federal law, but not the state or local laws. You also had sit-ins, which did a lot of the same. These are people who go to restaurants where there was supposed to be segregation, and they would sit down a lot of times at counters. We tend not to think about it today, but a lot of restaurants back then had counters. So you would go sit at the counters or at a booth or at a table. So these people would come up and sit at the counter and just sit there while people would kind of throw a fit. So some progress was made. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it prohibited discrimination in public facilities, employment, education, and voter registration. It also banned discrimination not only by race and color, but by sex, religion, and national origin. Then in the 24th Amendment, which happened in 1964, it outlawed the poll taxes, which if you remember was a way to do voter suppression. You also had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which empowers federal government to intervene in voter discrimination. Okay? So if there is some type of voter discrimination throughout the country, it gives the federal government to kind of step in and intervene there. And then in 1970, this one is kind of controversial, is affirmative action. Okay? Program intended to make up for past discriminations, program that encourages the hiring and promoting minorities and women in fields that were traditionally closed to them, sometimes called reverse discrimination. Then you also have racial profiling, which is more of our modern thing that y'all would be probably the most familiar with. It's being singled out because of the way you look. So, ICE typically focuses on Hispanics. After 9/11, a lot of people would profile people from the Middle East, and then the one that we tend to think of most commonly is African Americans being profiled by policemen. So, see y'all later.